Hey guys, I'm Ben and welcome to another episode of Epoch of Greatness. On these shows, we usually look at a particularly fruitful period for a band, which could be either commercially or artistically or both. However, in this case, we'll be looking at the band's whole career and various incarnations, as well as some of the related and side band materials. Of course, I'm talking about the mighty Nocturnus.
A lot of bands have been using keyboards in the studio and like live tapes and stuff like that for a really long time. You know, as far as I can remember back, Merciful Fate, bands like that, they use keyboards. And to me, it just, we're like, I guess, the only band that actually has a keyboard player like all the time.
I've had people come up to me like in Europe and go, man, I'm so pissed off because I wanted to put keyboards in the band that we were doing a year ago. And I said, no, it's not the thing. And then here comes your album. And it's like, and it's there and it's accepted, and they're kicking themselves in the ass for not having done it before,
So, Nocturnus was formed in 1987 by drummer and vocalist Mike Browning after his post-Morbid Angel band with Sterling Scarborough and Gino Marino called Incubus fell through after only recording one totally kick-ass demo that same year. Check it out. Sterling and Gino, who sadly have both passed away, were, according to Mike, both highly strung and difficult characters to work with, and Incubus imploded when the guys came to blows one day at the beach or something like that. I'll let Mike tell the story.
Yeah.
I know I went to work one day and Sterling and Gino didn't work, and they went to the beach, and I guess they got really drunk at the beach and were hitting on some girls, and Gino said something to Sterling and Sterling said something back, and Gino punched Sterling and knocked him out almost completely. Wow. And then Gino ran off down the beach and quit the band. And, and then when that happened, I was just like over the whole thing, Sterling was a maniac. I mean, he was a true crazy guy. Anywhere we went, he would try to start fights with anybody. I mean, he would go to the post office and start looking at people just trying to start fights with them. It was crazy hanging around him because you never knew what he was just out of his mind. He was always trying to do something crazy, like to make himself like out there, like he's a maniac, but he really was. So,
The music of Incubus, though, was absolute fire. And it's a damn shame they didn't hold it together a little longer so we could have gotten more music from them. Anyway, after the frustration of both the acrimonious split from Morbid Angel and the self-destructive implosion of Incubus, Mike Browning was determined to create his own band where he could play drums and sing and have a bit more control over its destiny. And so the first incarnation of Nocturnus was born. The lineup consisted of Mike, of course, Vincent Crowley on guitar of future Asheron fame, who had just left his old band Entity, and Richard Bateman, who had just quit Agent Steel, stating his reason for leaving was that John Cyrus from that band, the main dude, was just too much of a total weirdo to work with. that kind of rings true. I've heard stories about him. So Nocturnus got started as a three-piece, and most of the first material was actually Vincent's songs that he'd brought with him from Entity. After some time, Gino Marino would reconnect with Mike and join the band as the lead guitarist. While this lineup of the band would record their first self-titled demo, Nocturnus. This lineup would also be short-lived, with Richard, who sadly has also passed away, getting the call up from Florida legends Nasty Savage to join up with them. Also, tensions between Vincent and Gino were a constant, and eventually, coupled with his hatred of Tampa Heat, led Vincent to quit and move out of Florida altogether, leaving only Mike and Gino, and a good chunk of their songs being taken by Vincent with him, that would later, of course, become Acheron songs. So those songs actually ended up belonging to three bands, Entity, Nocturnus, and Acheron in the end. Anyway, this was probably fortuitous for the band, because they would end up bringing in the young guitar beast, Mike Davis, who was actually Gino's cousin and would bring a whole new level of technicality and guitar fire to the band. They'd bring Jeff Estes on bass, and after jamming with keyboardist Louis Panzer to help them sort of create some intros for the band, discovered that they had a great chemistry that actually worked within the songs as well, so he too was added to the lineup. So by 1988, the band was ready to unleash their second demo, showcasing their more evolved and complex style, the science of horror. All of these songs would ultimately find their way onto the band's debut, but these versions definitely have their very own distinct feel and personality, bringing, for example, a much more refined version of BC AD, or Before Christ After Death, than from the first demo to open things up, and it absolutely fucking smokes. I'm a real sucker for death metal demos from those first waves of death metal in the 80s, and this one is definitely a killer. The band was already a fully formed and explosive force to be reckoned with. The lead playing is top tier, and Mike's characteristic drumming and vocal styles are so catchy and are as infectious as ever. Like so many of the demos from this era too, the lo-fi and murky sound quality seems to add to the heaviness, and yet when the melodic sections arrive, they sort of manage to pierce through it with sort of atmospheric power and precision. It's really awesome stuff. Definitely check it out if you are a demos lover like myself. Anyway, Gino would continue to be just as difficult as always to work with and hang out with, or at least that's how Mike Browning has described it in interviews anyway. So his tenure with the band was to end in 1989, and they would bring in the last piece of the classic album lineup, longtime friend and neighbor to Mike Davis, and the equally technically gifted guitarist Sean McNenny. With the dynamic and powerful guitar team now, Nocturnus was ready to ramp up their technical and progressive creativity. The band was already breaking ground in the death metal world by having a permanent keyboardist, but they were about to become one of the seminal bands that would create the whole technical and progressive death metal subgenres. But unlike what those subgenres have become today, which is far more formulaic and predictable, Nocturnus at the time, along with bands like Atheist, Death, Cynic, and Pestilence, all were creating music that was not only cutting edge within the genre, but were all unique sounding individually. These days, 90% of the tech death bands all basically sound like necrophagists. But back then, they all had very much created their own extremely distinct sounds and styles. Nocturnus would make history with their remarkable debut album that has since been recognized as one of the foundation albums of this movement and death metal in general. Of course, I'm talking about the almighty album released in 1990, The Key. So, as I already said, the technicality and expertise was now fully ramped up and the band was creatively on fire on The Key. However, of course, nothing with Nocturnus ever runs smoothly, and even though they'd signed to Earache and were recording with Tom Morris at the legendary Morris Sound Studios, you think everything's going great, they were faced with Jeff Estes' alcoholism, almost derailing the whole affair.
Well, before we went into Morrisound, Tom came out and watched us practice once. And so we were practicing for Tom, and after we played a song, he looked at Jeff Estes, our bass player, and said, "Can you play that bass part? I want to hear what you're doing there." And Jeff was drunk, and he was like, "Oh, well, man, I really, I'm kind of buzzed right now." So I was there, and he's like, and he tried to play the bass part a couple of times, and he blubbed it by himself really bad, and he set his bass down and just left.
Wow.
And this was like 2 weeks before we were going to record the album. We did not see him again until the morning of Morrisound, the first day of recording. So I pull into the studio, Morrisound studio, the first morning. There's Jeff in the parking lot at like 8 o'clock in the morning, drunk already, fighting with his girlfriend. He comes in the studio, can't play the bass tracks, again, takes his bass and he leaves. So here we are in Morrisound with a week booked, and the bass player just walks out. Wow. And so Mike Davis was like, well, I wrote most of these riffs, so I guess I'm going to have to play the bass. Then Mike had to dub in all the bass parts. And he was literally, after he did his guitar parts, he would literally go in one of the rooms in Morrisound by himself and sit there and learn all the bass parts to every song. And then he came in there, and of course he played them with a pick, and Jeff would play with his fingers. So the bass wasn't what it was supposed to be at all, and it sounded more like a guitar playing bass. And so we mixed the bass really low.
Wow.
And like I said, my drums were in terrible condition. I had cracked cymbals. I didn't have that much money back then, and we didn't really have a budget to buy all new equipment to go in the studio.
So with Jeff showing up drunk and unable to play, he quit the band in the middle of recording, leaving it totally up to Mike Davis to learn and play all his parts. Nevertheless, the strength of the material was at such a level that despite the low-mixed Mike Davis bass parts and Mike Browning's very B-grade falling-apart drum kit that he was using at the time, the album would turn out to be an absolute fucking masterpiece and a classic. I adore this album. It's perfection. I love the production such as it is. I love Mike's drumming and vocals. So fucking cool. And while Mike Davis and Sean bring the technicality, I really have to say Mike Browning is the one who brings the death metal, and I love his primitive and distinctive approach and feel. It's what makes Nocturnus stand out for me, is that juxtaposition of Mike's approach with the extreme technicality on top of it. It sort of reminds me, it's similar how in thrash, Coroner, for example, had a similar thing going with Markey, having a more primitive drive to his style of drumming underneath Tommy's incredible neoclassical and technical guitars. Thematically, Nocturnus were also breaking ground, mixing occult themes with science fiction narratives, which were fleshed out in multiple tracks. The last 5 songs actually are one single story that map out the story of the Key and discuss time traveling back to when Jesus was a baby and killing him to prevent the spread of Christianity. This evil character presented in the famous Dan Seagrave artwork on the cover would later resurface and form the continuing narrative basis of what would later be Nocturnus AD, but we'll get to that. In 1991, after recruiting Jim O'Sullivan for bass duties, Nocturnus would head out on the road supporting Bolt Thrower to promote the album, and then join the Grind Crusher tour with Morbid Angel, Napalm Death, and Godflesh. Things with Jim wouldn't work out, and when the tour ended, he was dropped as well. By 1992, and after heavy pressure from Earache Records, Nocturnus would recruit a lead vocalist in Dan Izzo from Tortured Soul.
I mean, it started really with Earache saying we needed a front man. When it came to Thresholds, and we actually had a song or two, Grid Zone was already written. When we were touring with the Key, we played Grid Zone a few times, and I was singing it. So I thought I was going to be singing on Thresholds. And then Earache said, look, you need a front man. You're behind this big drum set. Nobody can see you. The guitar players aren't moving around a lot. The keyboard player, stuck behind the keyboard. So you need a focus, some that the crowds can focus on. So either you sing and quit playing drums, or play drums and get a singer. And I didn't really want to do that. But everybody else was like, oh, we could be really big. It's like Dream Theater was a big band at the time. And so Earache said, all right, if you don't get a front man, we're going to cut your budget and we're not going to give you a video, because MTV just had Headbangers Ball, was just getting started. And they told us we were going to be able to do a video that they could probably get on Headbangers Ball. Well, they're like, well, if you're singing and playing drums, we're not going to do a video, and we're not going to give you the budget that we were going to give you for the second record unless you get a vocalist. So it basically was 4 people in the band wanted to get a vocalist, and I didn't.
This was on the promise that the label would pay for a proper video, which they ultimately did. Anyway, with a new singer in tow and a session bass player brought in to record, the band would head back to Morrisound, and in 1992, they released their killer sophomore album, Thresholds.
Your universe is only a product of your mind.
So by the time the band had got to Thresholds, some dynamics were changing within the band. Because of the fact that the new singer had been brought in, Mike Browning was no longer involved in writing the vocals and lyrics, so that made the band head even further into the sci-fi themes and away from the occult and anti-religious themes. It also seemed to change the power dynamics within the band, with Davis, McNanny, and Panzer writing most of the material, which led them to more progressive elements, while the death metal and heaviness was dialed down noticeably. Now, to my ears, this album is still awesome and I love it. It was actually my first Nocturnus album, so it has a nostalgic power for me. And for many years, I would have said it's my favorite, but eventually the Key would outshine it for me. Anyway, that's not really important. What is important is that tensions in the band were growing, and Mike Browning was feeling more and more disconnected creatively and personally from the other guys. Even still, the music on Thresholds is great, bringing in more progressive elements, classical elements, and instrumental, and even acoustic guitars. All serve to dial down the heaviness and up the progginess, which would be somewhat divisive among the fans especially the die-hard death metal purists who already had an axe to grind about the keyboards, saw it as going way too far away from death metal. And at the same time, the more progressively minded fans lapping it up and loving the fantasy sci-fi driven ride through the universe. The label would keep their promise, and Alter Reality would get a video clip, and the band would head to Europe to tour the album. However, the band grew increasingly discontented with Earache because of the small amount of money they were making from the tour. Simultaneously, once the tour ended, the creative and personal tensions with Mike Browning and the band would come to a head. McNenny and Panzer would go behind Browning's back and register the name Nocturnus to them, adding Mike Davis as well, leaving him, Dan Izzo, and new bassist Emo Maori out. Then, in an even more sneaky move, after doing that, they fired the founding member and original driving force of the band, Mike Browning. So he was kicked out of his own band. For many fans, this was too much of a low act, and the point where many of them dropped off following the band altogether, which is totally understandable. This was Mike's band from day one, and at their best, it was his voice and feel that gave the technicality, the balls they needed to not end up a slightly heavier Dream Theater or something. It was pretty underhanded and shitty way to handle the whole thing, but sometimes in show business it gets pretty dirty, and it's certainly nowhere near the worst stories I've ever heard. Needless to say though, the acrimony between Browning and McNenny and Panzer never really went away. Anyway, Nocturnus would continue recruiting drummer James Marcinek. However, the relationship with Earache began to splinter, and even though the band were in preparation for their third album, having written several songs including Mummified, Invertebrate Plague, The Great Spot, and Orbital Decay, the label had had enough of them and their contract was dumped. The new lineup put out a 2-song EP in 1993, which featured a recycled early song, Possess the Priest, and the brand new Mummified. On the EP, the self-titled Nocturnus. As a huge Mike Browning fan myself, I hate to admit that I like anything they did without him, but if I'm truthful, this little glimpse into the album that could have been is absolutely great. The song Possess the Priest rules, and it might be one of their best songs. It's fucking awesome. They seem to bring back some of their speed and intensity, which is kind of ironic considering the differences with Browning, which really betray the truth that it was probably more personal than creative. Mummified also kicks ass, incorporating Egyptian melodies into their already expansive arsenal. Listening to this EP, this super short EP, just makes me think what a great album it could have been had they not dumped Mike and had they not been dumped by Earache. History though doesn't and didn't play out that way, and because of the lack of support and the growing discontent, as well as the lack of mature leadership that they had from Mike Browning, the band quickly fell apart at the seams and disbanded. It seemed that Nocturnus were done and dusted, with most of the guys disappearing from the music scene altogether, with the exception of Mike Davis, who had a short-lived project with Trey Azagoth from Morbid Angel that never ended up really seeing the light of day. However, in the late 90s, Sean McNenny and Louis Panzer began playing together again, writing ambient metal riffs, eventually deciding that these new ideas could work as new Nocturnus material. Mike Davis and Emo Maori were added to the fold, along with drummer Rick Bizarro, and just like that, Nocturnus was reincarnated. the band was able to get a contract for a new album through Season of Mist, and in 1999 they released the very overlooked Ethereal Tomb. So when I said many fans switched off from this band after Browning left, I really wasn't kidding. This album almost never gets talked about, and while I agree that it's not as groundbreaking as their first two albums or as cool as the demos, it's still excellent progressive technical death metal that has so many of the elements that made those early albums great. The same manic, complex riff writing and explosive onslaughts of leads from Davis and McNenny, the same sci-fi and atmospheric keyboard layering from Panzer, and generally still very strong arrangements and playing all around. Emo on vocals does a good job, even if he's not as distinct as Mike or Dan, and Bizarro is solid on the kit. I think the biggest thing this album misses is Mike's natural, primitive death metal drum feel, and it's also more refined and ambient to some degree, so yeah, it is backing off a little bit. But even still, songs like the opener Orbital Decay, Apostle of Evil, and The Science of Horror are all great. And for those who have stayed away from this album out of maybe a loyalty to Mike or some other reason, I'd say definitely revisit it. Sure, I don't put it quite on the same level as the first two classics, but it's not that far off either, and nobody really sounds like these guys and never really have. So if you love the Nocturnus sound, then you've got a whole pretty solid album just waiting for your ear holes, so go check it out. Anyway, for whatever reason, this version of Nocturnus, despite having a pretty good new album under their belts, weren't able to really get anywhere. Perhaps it was the fact that music had changed and people weren't hungry for that style anymore, or perhaps they still had resentment for them for stabbing Mike in the back, or perhaps it was just a lack of promotion from the label. Whatever the case, this lineup of Nocturnus would finally and permanently disband in 2002. Again, one might think this would be the end of the story, but it just so happened that around the same time, in mid-1999, Mike Browning, Richard Bateman, and Gino Marino, all the first original lineup of Nocturnus in 1987, reformed as Nocturnus AD, with Mike Walkowski on guitars replacing Vincent Crowley, who was busy with Acheron. The name was changed to After Death in 2000, so it wouldn't be associated with Nocturnus, in the United States anyway. The band again performed as Nocturnus in 2013 overseas for selected shows, though not in the US, again for copyright issues. The other guys still own the name. What are you going to do? After Death, as they were known, would go on to record several excellent demos and an EP called Vibrations in 2000, which would only eventually get a proper release with the awesome compilation album that I highly recommend from 2007 called Retronomicon. All of this is very much a summation of events, and for a number of years it was pretty confusing about were they after Death, were they Nocturnus or Nocturnus AD? Well, the short answer is yes to everything. They were all of these things at some point during that period. However, Mike Browning would make the smarter business decision to finally stick with the Nocturnus AD moniker, AD as in after death. And even though he is the only actual Nocturnus member in the band and everyone else is from after death, it still finally felt like Nocturnus were back. In 2019, this newly invigorated incarnation of the band would release their comeback album as Nocturnus AD called Paradox.
Breaking through the seals of fate, as we lead through the gate, leading to unconsent from my inward
everybody was seeing us play the Nocturnus stuff live in After Death. And After Death, I wanted to be different than Nocturnus, but everybody kept saying, it's like, you know, when you go see Ozzy's band, he will always play at the end Paranoid or Iron Man. You know, he always plays a Black Sabbath song at the end. So I thought, well, you know, we started playing, you know, a song or two off the key when we do After Death shows. And then people were like, man, you guys got that old Nocturnus sound when you play the Nocturnus songs. So we're like, okay, so we started switching songs up from the key and playing more and more of them live. And so many people came to me and said, man, you really need to redo this again. You know, it's been a long time. The other guys aren't doing anything. You really need to do, you know, Nocturnus again. So I knew I couldn't use the name. So I went with the Nocturnus AD and decided to continue the key story. And it just kind of grew from there.
What's amazing about Paradox is even though besides Mike, this is an entirely new lineup. You know, you've got Daniel Tucker on bass, Bilal Kobliak, fuck it. I always fuck people's names up, on guitars. You got Damien Haftel, I think, on guitars, and Josh Holdren, I think it is. Fuck, I'm shit with names sometimes. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You get the idea. You can look it up on fucking Metal Archives. And if any of the guys are watching, sorry, I always fuck people's names up, so don't take offense. Even though they're all new guys, they somehow managed to channel the album, The Key, so well. And, you know, if you didn't know the lineup was all new, you could easily believe it was the original guys. The keyboard atmospheres and sci-fi are all there in full force. The familiar Mike Browning drum fills and the highly frantic and technical riffing and explosive guitar solo trade-offs, it's all there. The only difference to my ears is that, at least on Paradox anyway, the soloing seems at times more to be channeling like maybe Trey Azagoth from Morbid Angel's more wild and unhinged style rather than Mike Davis's more 80s Guitar Hero shredding style. Although, you know, that said, there's still plenty of Guitar Hero shred here too. But the wild explosiveness of The Key is in full effect, and these guys recorded the album the old way. So there's no studio trickery to fix things up and, you know, or, you know, lock things to the grid and make everything all fucking perfect. And I love that. It's sorely lacking in today's metal world, and I wish there was more of it, to be honest. My only slight beef with this album is that Mike's vocals have become less harsh and closer to almost a spoken word delivery, which is, you know, it's great if you want to hear the stories, which are, you know, continuations from The Key. However, as someone who really loves Mike's old death metal growls, he's one of my favorites, I do miss that a little here. Songs like the awesome Paleolithic, which continues the story from The Key's Neolithic, as well as the last few tracks continuing the story of The Key's main character, Dr. Magus, all absolutely slay, and I really feel this album was an incredible return. You know, usually when an older band reconstitutes with a new lineup, it's often a money grab or just lame and doesn't capture any of what the band, what made the band great in the first place. But not here. They definitely recaptured the magic, and it's clear from the material and the production values that Mike and the band really mean it, and the sincerity and love of extreme metal shines through loud and clear. Anyway, the album would have a very positive reception with fans, myself included, and this would breathe a new life and impetus into Nocturnus AD to keep moving forward. Unfortunately for the guys and, the rest of the whole fucking world, we had the cough of unknown origins and the subsequent shutdown of the whole fucking world. Can you believe that shit actually happened? Fucking shit. Anyway, don't get me started on that. It still pisses me off. Anyway, as well as fucking all of us, Nocturnus also found their momentum pretty much ground to a halt on from Paradox. But like the true creatives these guys are, instead of it holding them back, they just used the extra time to go back writing for the next and most recent offering that has only just come out this year in 2024 and is part 3 of the Keys' multiple storylines. I'm talking about Unicursal. So, once again, like Paradox, this album was written in the most old school, collaborative way possible. The guys rehearsed at Mike's house and they literally wrote everything together in the room, each of them offering ideas for riffs and arrangements, and like Paradox, the organic nature of the music radiates out of this album. Something this complex these days would usually be composed by one person and sent by computer around to the other guys to learn or add their contributions to. All safely fixable in Pro Tools and Beat Detective and all that shit. But once again, Nocturnus AD went old school, and it makes what they achieved more impressive here. And it's also, I would say, it accounts for the length of time it took to write the album. The album, of course, is still pretty new to me, but so far I'm really enjoying it. It's cool to see the continuations in songs like Mesolithic and the whole Dr. Magus, i.e. the key main character, hearing more tales from his perspective. Songs like Orgasm 46B is so damn explosive with guitars launching into space while shooting fucking lasers in every direction. And Mike's drums are really fucking relentless. It's awesome. Very cool stuff. Mission Malkuth, they managed to really summon up this cool dark atmosphere sort of among the chaos on that one. Very cool. Again, the obvious slight disappointment, and it is slight, but it's Mike's new spoken vocal style. I wish he did more of his old school growls, but it's not a deal breaker for me. But as I said, I'm still learning this album, and I'm sure I'll have a clearer idea of where it will sit in the overall catalog as time progresses. But for now, I'm loving it. I'm loving having a new Nocturnus album to explore and to get to know. And I hope these guys have more success and are able to keep bringing these great creative albums so deep into their long and storied career. Nocturnus have always been a divisive band in the death metal world. Too techy and proggy for the purest old heads, and too heavy and brutal for lovers of most prog metal and prog rock. Yet, they've always managed to find a loyal audience who gets what they're about and loves them for it, and I'm proud to say I'm in that camp. Great fucking band, and that has been their Epoch of Greatness. Anyway guys, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. stay metal, and see you next time.